moving along to our next presenter of the morning, who is Senna Catenacci, and will be presenting work on cities of plight, climate justice intervention in Baltimore and Seattle. Faculty advisor is Sarah Mills, and reader is Sarah Hughes.
Hi. Sure. Okay. Hello again. My name is Senna, and I'm a major in PitE and poli-sci. And for my thesis, I looked at climate justice intervention in Baltimore and Seattle. Sorry. So I'll start with just an overview of what I'll talk about. I'll begin with an introduction of what local climate governance is and what it looks like, as well as what climate justice itself is and what kind of features constitute it. And then I'll go into the research questions that guided my thesis, of which there were 3, and the methods that I used to execute them. And then I'll get into the bulk of my research, which was my analysis and conclusions, where I'll discuss the findings of my research through analyses of the cities. And I will relate this back to existing literature, as well as path forwards for future research and the limitations of my own. And I'll end with some key takeaways. So to start with an introduction of municipal climate action and actors, climate change is felt particularly acutely in cities, and cities are really important in the climate movement because of their high densities and the fact that a majority of the world's population lives there, approximately 70%. And consequently, cities are also significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and accelerants of climate change. Local government, however, has the power to potentially make policies with the most immediate results. This is partially due to the fact that cities tend to be more homogeneous than the population as a whole, but of course this isn't always true. However, when it is, it can potentially make it easier to enact legislation that has more direct impacts due to the proximity of local governance versus, say, at the federal level. The extent to which this is true, however, depends on the city's population and resources, and the resources also often depend on the city's population itself. And unfortunately, climate change has become a pretty political issue, so that too can have a sway in the extent of government intervention. However, government intervention isn't the only kind of actor who has the potential to make an impact in this movement. There are a variety of institutions that have the capability to pursue climate change intervention, and predominantly these are nonprofits and NGOs, as well as community members. So to go back to my first point, this is a density map of the US. And what's most interesting to note is that the cities with the highest densities tend to be along the coastline. And this is important because coastal cities share their own unique set of climate hazard potentials, namely sea level rise. So to get into climate justice specifically, researchers have outlined sort of 3 pillars that comprise the field. The first one of these is procedural justice, and this includes having input from all relevant stakeholders, though particularly with an emphasis on the people who are most impacted by the issue at hand, so in this case, climate change. And this may look like door-to-door canvassing or outreach. However, predominantly it takes place in the form of public meetings and workshops to gauge residential input. There is also distributive justice, which concerns an equitable concentration of environmental benefits and harms. And an example of this that was especially prevalent in my research was the idea of urban heat islands, where lower income communities tend to have less trees and greenery than wealthier ones. And consequently, the cement in those neighborhoods will absorb more heat and make them significantly warmer than they otherwise would be. And this has the potential to pose health risks for the people that live there. And furthermore, there's also issues of having so many impervious surfaces such as cement, which can cause issues for stormwater drainage and management, which can lead to flooding. So these are all very interconnected issues. Then lastly, there is justice as recognition, and this mandates a confrontation of injustices and a reversal of the policies that have led to them. So this is essentially just acknowledgement by government of the failures of them to address all populations equally in the past and a mandate to do so in the future. So I had, as I said, three questions that guided my research. The overarching one was, to what extent are these three facets of climate justice being incorporated into the initiatives undertaken in Baltimore and Seattle? However, I was also concerned with if these actions and the quantity of them differ according to socioeconomic status, and I'll get into this a bit more in my method section. And lastly, I wanted to know who the actors that were responsible for these actions were, as well as, again, if these differed according to the city and the context. So for my methodology, I conducted 2 case studies and compared them, as I said, of Baltimore and Seattle. And this was conducted through a sort of narrowing process where I began with an environmental, like very broadly, I began with an environmental justice policy scan of 26 US cities. And I did this because I needed to know that there was some foundation of environmental justice work, otherwise there'd be nothing for me to really study or compare. And I also knew that the 2 cities that I chose had to be the same in every way except for socioeconomic status. So that's mainly race and income. And that's because I was curious to see if that made a difference at all in what was happening in these areas. So I also had to consider the extent of climate hazards that were taking place. And to do that, I analyzed sea level rise risk and future risk. After doing all this, that's how I ended up with Baltimore and Seattle. And for my framework, I utilized, again, the 3 climate justice pillars that I talked about, as well as the actors who were responsible. And lastly, I used qualitative data, namely websites such as that of governments, nonprofits, and advocacy groups, though I also used policy databases and newspaper articles. So to get into my analysis and conclusions, I'll start with Baltimore. And I found that recognition here mostly was evident in the form of government plans and future strategies, and they were a result of municipal action. So for example, there was a document called the Baltimore Sustainability Plan, or another one called the Disaster Preparedness and Planning Project. As far as distributional justice, that was also present, although kind of like recognition, these were through largely non-enforceable measures, and they didn't really include any mechanisms to ensure that they were actually executed. So consequently, there was pretty limited tangible action that had been done. And these findings were also true of procedural justice in Baltimore. Going on to Seattle, there was pretty similar findings as well, where recognition was again the most common form of justice, though there wasn't an absence of distributive and procedural justice either. But again, the intentions for the future very much outweighed the current and past action that had actually been taken to date. Much of the work in Seattle too was a result of nonprofit involvement rather than the government. And I'll talk more about this and comparing the cases, because I found that when putting them in conversation with one another, they were relatively similar in terms of the amount of each kind of justice that was present in the cities, although the main difference here was who was responsible for this action. I found that in the case of Baltimore, there was more governmental involvement than nonprofit. However, the opposite was true in Seattle. And in both cases, there was sporadic individual and small group intervention as well. And this was largely in the form of things such as lobbying or rallies or individual workshops that were held. However, I'll get more into this later, but this research may not be completely holistic of this sort of involvement. So after looking at these findings, I wanted to go back and review the literature again because it was kind of interesting to me because my intuition would say that for those areas which are largely poorer, there wouldn't be as much government involvement, just due to the fact that resources are likely to be more limited and there may just perhaps not be as much interest in it on the behalf of government officials. Um, However, and in that case, then nonprofit would kind of come in and bridge the gap. However, what I found was opposite. So I went back and looked at studies that analyzed just NGO location citing. I found that my results pretty much aligned with a lot of what was found in those studies as well, where indicators of need, such as poverty or educational attainment or health outcomes, really weren't correlating with the number of NGOs in an area. Rather, one of the important findings that they found were that donor influence could potentially have a pretty high impact because even though NGOs are supposed to be independent, they also largely rely on donor funding. And this kind of presents the opportunity for outsiders with money to dictate what they want an NGO to do or where they want them to go. And furthermore, there's also a concern with risk aversion for nonprofits, where there's kind of an incentive for them to not go to an area where there's a high possibility of failure. So therefore, they'll go to places where there's kind of already where the groundwork has already been laid for the work that's to be done, and that's usually due to other NGOs, which is why you might see them congregated in specific areas. And this may explain why I saw so many concentrated together in Seattle. So in terms of limitations, one of the big ones, which I kind of alluded to earlier, was that I was unable to speak directly with the people in these locations. So consequently, there may be things that I missed. However, if there wasn't an online presence to the work that was being done, I really wouldn't have seen it. And this is probably most likely in the case of like residential movements there and kind of like lower level community level movements. Furthermore, time restraint kind of prevented really in-depth investigation into this. So this research is a bit more at a distance than I would have liked. However, in the future, besides remediating these issues, I would like to explore more whether or not socioeconomic status is attributable to NGO location citing. As I said, I found studies that suggested that there was a sort of relationship. However, there was also another study that said that there wasn't. And the extent of all of them were pretty limited. So letting into this more could have pretty significant impacts for how nonprofits operate in the future and where they choose to go. And furthermore, I'd like to look at how the politics of local government affects both the quantity and quality of intervention that occurs there. As I said, politics can kind of be a hard barrier to overcome. So especially depending on the location, so that can potentially play a big impact too in the amount of work that's really being conducted in an area. So going over the main takeaways from this research, I found that climate justice has not gone unnoticed in these cities. However, tangible and explicit intervention is less common than aspirations. Another thing that I sort of saw a lot was even if there was an initiative that had the same intended effect, such as incorporating local community voices, they wouldn't say explicitly that it was procedural justice. And I think that kind of normalizing that sort of rhetoric could be important in making sure that it's actually followed through upon and is more widespread. Furthermore, I found that the extent of intervention in Baltimore and Seattle is pretty similar, though these were largely performed by different entities. And lastly, it appears that socioeconomic status could be a possible factor in determining who does what in regards to climate action. However, again, a lot more research is needed to more concretely say what the relationship is and how strong it is. And then lastly, I would just like to very much thank my advisor, Sarah Mills, who dedicated a bunch of time working with me on my thesis and helping me to edit it and was really instrumental in how I got it done. And I'd also like to thank Sarah Hughes, who's my reader, for her amazing edits as well, and also for writing her own awesome research that was really influential in informing the methodologies that I used in my thesis. So that is all I have, but I will take any questions that you guys may have.
Thank you so much, Senna. That was a very nice job. We have time for a few questions. So let's do Sarah and then Jason.
Great, thank you, Senna. This was a huge undertaking, and Senna had a whole bunch of details behind kind of what the actions specifically were. And I'm wondering if you want to share a little bit more about kind of, you know, what stood out to you within each individual, like in Baltimore or Seattle, in terms of what are specific actions, or also kind of the timing of this. You mentioned that that there's a lot of talk right now, but not a whole lot of follow through and implementation. And, you know, can you give people a sense of like how recent a lot of the climate justice work is in these communities?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the work that I found was like relatively recent. And I mean, climate justice isn't like new, but it's relative to other fields that can be, it's more recent. It's like I said, kind of putting explicit names to it isn't especially common yet either. In terms of specific action, there was, so like in terms of like concrete action I've seen, there was a couple standouts for each city. So I know in Baltimore, one of the things that they've done recently is filed a lawsuit against BP and I think like 25 other oil companies due to like their main claim was that it was disproportionately harming certain communities. And a lot of legal action hasn't really been taken in regards to that. So I thought that was really cool. That started in 2018, though I don't think it's completed yet. And then in Seattle, one of the things that they've done that I thought was kind of cool, recently, within the past couple of years, they instituted like a payroll tax where they would tax like the biggest companies in the city higher and allocate that funding to communities for things such as like affordable housing or like lobbying for Seattle's version of the Green New Deal. So I thought those were pretty cool. I know that's also facing a lawsuit from the companies because they don't want to be taxed higher, obviously. So that's kind of in the process right now.
Jason, go ahead.
So I think actually Sarah's question kind of got at some of the things I was curious about, Senna, but maybe more specifically, one of the things that really struck me in what you were talking about was kind of the fact that in both of the cases you looked at, it seemed like, and you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but I think I heard you say it seemed like that recognition seemed to be like the biggest focus of the climate justice policies. And that was interesting to me because of the fact that you said in Baltimore, it was mainly a government kind of driven process. And in Seattle, it was more of a community NGO driven process. And yet they're both ending up with kind of climate justice policies that are more recognition oriented. And I just wonder if you have any like ideas about like why that's the case. Is this just like lower hanging fruit, or are there other factors that seem to be kind of more heavily influencing things in that direction?
Yeah, so I think you kind of got at it from what I could tell. Recognition, like it's kind of again like a more less known aspect of this, but I think it is kind of in the scheme of things easier to do. Because like I said, like you didn't have recognition and more like in the intention focus. And it's like it can be easier for like a government to say like, okay, yeah, we get that we were wrong. We want to do this in the future. But I think it takes more effort to kind of explain how you're going to do that, which is where like distributive justice comes in, or like procedural justice. So I think it's definitely like it's kind of like an easier asset to implement.
So it says here that you are in the process of applying for fellowships in the nonprofit sector related to climate resilience. So it seems like you'll be hopefully continuing some of this work in one way or another, and you're also open to pretty much any location, both nationally and internationally. Do you have sort of a dream place to end up?
Not exactly. Like in terms of the US, I have always been interested in like the Pacific Northwest. I think that would be really cool. But I'm really, like I said, I don't really care. I think whatever opportunities I think is best is where I'll go.
Well, best of luck to you wherever you happen to end up. And so I think your work is really a credit to being able to look at this through lots of different ways. And so good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
So we'll be moving